Regarded by many as being the principal work of Nikos Kazantzakis, The Odyssey, a modern sequel, with its excess of 33,000 lines, is perhaps more admired than actually read. And yet, to engage in its pages is to undertake a magnificent journey into the human spirit and to find a wisdom that stuns with its beauty. In this lecture, Howard F. Dossor, the author of Colin Wilson, The Man and His Mind, and a regular lecturer at Melbourne's Existentialist Society, opens a gateway into this truly monumental work. Here is Howard Dossor.
Throughout his entire lifetime, the colossus of 20th century Greek literature, Nikos Kazantzakis, was an inveterate traveller. When he was 6 years old, his family was forced by the Cretan uprising against the Turks to flee to the Greek mainland, while again, in his 14th year, he moved to the island of Naxos to undertake his secondary schooling. His formal education continued in Athens and then in Paris. Among the countries he visited were Germany, Italy, Switzerland, Japan, China, England, Spain, and Russia. He wrote important analyses of the political and cultural issues prevalent in the last 5 of these countries, as well as a volume on his extensive travels throughout Greece. He was a traveller on the last day of his life, dying of leukemia in Freiburg, Germany, while on his way home following a visit to China. Travelling for Kazantzakis was not simply the restless rambling of a tourist. Born into a heritage that contained within its very centre the literary Homeric epic The Odyssey, he chose to interpret the journey as a symbol of the meaningful life. It was, for him, the equivalent of the comet traversing the evening sky, which he took to represent life itself as it asserted itself over against the abyss. Each individual journey was itself a crucial part of and a symbol representing life in its entirety. Indeed, for Kazantzakis, the allegedly blind Homer was not simply a storyteller, but one of those he designated as protectors of the Odyssey, those great souls who upheld him in his effort to contend with the abyss and wrest meaning out of its grasp. Together with Homer, he bracketed such luminaries as Dante, Shakespeare, Nietzsche, Muhammad, Genghis Khan, Lenin, Jesus, Cervantes, Leonardo, and El Greco, writing poems in honour of many of these. But here, while we simply note this band of protectors, we must give closer attention to Homer and his literary masterpiece. Homer's Odyssey was the second volume of a trilogy written around the end of the 8th century BCE. The first volume was, of course, the Iliad, also from the pen of Homer and translated by Kazantzakis, while the third was the now lost the Telegony, this third probably being written not by Homer, but by a writer known as Xenophon of Sparta. Almost certainly, the 3 works were anthologies, constructed from ancient myths and legends which had been passed down through the preceding centuries, as far back as the Bronze Age, by way of oral tradition. The Odyssey is a record of a decade-long journey by the hero Odysseus, later to be called colloquially the Archer by Kazantzakis, but more commonly known in English as Ulysses, as he winds his way home to the kingdom of Ithaca, of which he is the monarch, after having fought in the Trojan Wars. Drawing him ever homeward are the familial figures of Penelope, his wife, and Telemachus, his son. But the burden of the poem is to recount the challenges Odysseus encounters as he travels. In the opening line of the poem, Homer sets out the task he has set himself in writing the poem. Tell me, O Muse, of that ingenuous hero who travelled far and wide after he had sacked the famous city of Troy. Many cities did he visit, and many were the nations with whose manners and customs he was acquainted. Moreover, he suffered much by sea while trying to save his own life and bring his men safely home. But do what he might, he could not save his men, for they perished through their own sheer folly in eating the cattle of the sun god Hyperion. So the gods prevented them from ever reaching home. Tell me too about all these things, O daughter of Jove, from whatsoever source you may know them. Homer's poem is comprised of 12,110 lines. Its vocabulary makes use of a variety of the dialects that were in use throughout ancient Greece, and there are indications that Homer chose between the dialects carefully, according to their capacity to enrich the telling of each incident in his story. The very word Odyssey has been incorporated into English and used as a synonym for the word journey. The name Odysseus bears the root meaning of trouble, notwithstanding whether one is the cause of trouble or its victim. Kazantzakis made much of the notion of trouble. Life, he had learned from his friend Alexis Zorba, was trouble, and it was a requirement of man that he should undo his belt and look for trouble. But for Kazantzakis, trouble was much more than the petty daily inconveniences, or even the significant setbacks that Zorba encountered on his passageway through life. For Kazantzakis, trouble was a confrontation with the abyss. It was a wrestle with ignorance, indifference, and insensitivity, the adversary that had to become overcome in the perpetual battle to win new ground in the ascent towards a richer, more human condition. Kazantzakis' poem is somewhat longer than Homer's. It is comprised of no less than 33,333 lines, nor does it simply express existing myths and legends as did Homer's. Each line was created in the fertile imagination of its author and gave shape to an intellectual dialogue that was taking place in his ever-active mind. Step by step, and without pausing for consolidation into stanzas, the arguments flew onto the page in a fervid stream of effervescent beauty. And yet, again and again, the reader is forced to pause, and catch breath at the power of an image or the explosive energy of an intellectual insight. Like Homer, Kazantzakis was meticulous in his choice of vocabulary. Resisting the formal language of classical or modern Greek, he chose to express himself in the demotic or simple language of his compatriots, not merely as a matter of choice, but because it was the demotic that gave him the range he required to press home his contentions or to shape his visions. In search of an appropriate word, he scoured rural Greek villages, inquiring of children and older residents the meaning of local words as he heard them used, or asking them how they would express particular ideas in their own regional speech. To the subtlety and appropriateness of the demotic language, Kazantzakis adds the unparalleled richness of his own poetic versatility. In his introduction to his impeccable translation of the epic, Kimon Fryer lists 65 metaphors Kazantzakis creates to represent the sun. To note merely 5 of them is to catch something of the poet that lies at the heart of the man. The sun is an expert archer who kneels on mountain summits and stretches his bow taut to shoot with arrows of flame. The sun is a vermilion quoit hurled against the sky's rim by dawn. It is the golden cap of the mind. The sun is a golden tassel hanging from the fox fur cap of death. It is the golden egg from which day is hatched. But the inescapable fact about the Odyssey, a modern sequel, is that it is not only a beautifully poetical construction or even an enthralling story. It is the artistic expression of one of the most exciting philosophical interpretations of the human condition ever developed by man's intellectual enterprise. Kazantzakis began the first of many drafts of his poem upon his return from Italy to Crete in 1925. 2 years earlier, he had completed his major philosophical statement in the slim volume Ascetiki, translated into English as The Saviours of God. While the completed poem, eventually published in 1938, stands independently, its full significance can be comprehended only by those who have at least some degree of understanding of this earlier work, most assuredly the work by which his entire oeuvre is ultimately to be judged. For Kazantzakis, the poem was a dramatic explication of the ideas he had formulated and expressed as a set of spiritual exercises in the Saviours of God. Reduced to its simplest, the argument set out in the Saviours of God may be expressed as follows. Man finds himself in a world in which he knows essentially nothing about his origin and very little about his end. His task lies in accepting his position as an existent being and directing his life to a process of growth aimed at the greater enrichment of life through an enfoldment of his self into the wholeness that he intuitively understands to constitute reality. By way of ever-expanding relationships, a man ascends towards the highest values of which he can conceive, understanding that it is his contribution to the ongoing life force, rather than his individual aggrandizement, that represents his essential value. This is the fundamental philosophical position Kazantzakis explicates in The Odyssey, a modern sequel. In turning to the poem itself, it is to be acknowledged that it is virtually impossible to do justice to the magnitude of the work, or even to reflect its grandeur. No outline of the story can be adequate, although the synopsis provided by Kimon Fryer in an appendix to his rendering of the work is of inestimable value. Nothing less than an actual reading of the text can reveal the relevance of its argument or the majesty with which that argument is articulated. Nonetheless, we can take note of individual incidents within the story that illustrate its thrust. At the close of Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus has returned home to find a troublesome domestic situation. Penelope has concluded that his extended absence can only be explained by his death, and she and Telemachus are in a state of mourning. The palace in which they live is virtually engulfed by a band of suitors, all seeking the hand of the supposed widow, because it entails access to the monarchy thought to be vacant. Faithfully, however, she repulses them. In a bloody concluding passage, Homer has the incensed Odysseus slay the suitors in the courtyard of the palace and then retreat inside its walls to wash himself. Kazantzakis begins his sequel with the word "and," as if he is concluding an unfinished sentence from the end of Homer's classic. He then creates his key opening scene. For hours he washed himself in the warm water. His veins spread out like rivers in his body. His loins cooled, and his great mind was in the waters cleansed and calmed. Then, with aromatic oil, he softly smoothed his long, coarse hair, hardened his body with black brine, till youthfulness awoke within his wintry flesh. On golden-studded nails in fragrant shadows flashed row upon row the robes his faithful wife had woven, embroidered with whirling winds and gods and sturdy ships. And stretching out a sunburnt hand, he quickly chose the one most flaming, flung it flat across his back, and, steaming still, shot back the bolt and crushed the threshold. Predictably, the threshold Odysseus crosses eventually becomes a doorway into a new and remarkable set of journeys and adventures. But in keeping with the author's objectives, these adventures contain elements of intellectual challenge as much, if not more, invigorating to the reader than they are for Odysseus. Leaving Ithaca for the final time and joining forces from time to time with a whole host of characters with names such as Captain Clam, Hardihood, Granite and Rocky, and encountering antagonists such as the Serpent Sisters and the Holy Harlots, Odysseus persists in his attempt to identify and release the spiritual that lies entrapped within the material. The day after he has slain his wife's suitors, Odysseus fills a vial with their blood and visits a local burial ground, where he sprinkles the blood on the ground in celebration of his victory. He then dances among the gravestones, vividly sensing that he is joined in his dance by the ghosts of his forebears, who rise from their graves to share his pleasure in his achievements. We should note that for Kazantzakis, dance is but another name for the fundamental life force that forges its way through space, time and essence to further its own becoming. The dance completed, Odysseus leaves the cemetery and climbs a nearby mountain where his eyes take in an extraordinary panoramic view. And when he stepped at length on the bald mountain's peak and saw his poor isle's slender body far below, he blinked his eyelids to hold back his brimming tears. "This is the rock, the bare, dry rock I've loved and longed for," he murmured then, and teardrops on his lashes gleamed. His mind, a hovering hawk, spied out the world below. Gold sunburnt beaches bathed like athletes by the sea. All huts were drowned in light, and on the sun-drenched fields the sluggish oxen cut the earth's fruit-bearing womb. Odysseus felt his heart fill up with freshening sea. For hours he gleaned his country's sweetness from its summit. Here we are reminded of Kazantzakis himself as a virile youth, climbing Mount Silurete in the heart of Crete with a young Irish girl who was visiting his village, and sharing the night with her in a small mountaintop chapel. In the morning, while fearing that he might be struck dead for his blasphemy in the chapel, he is astonished as he gazes down on the full circle of his native coastline and imagines Crete with its 3 mountain peaks as a 3-masted frigate in which God sailed into history. But if there were 3 masts, there were also 3 elements to the vista. Simply by turning his head, Kazantzakis could take in Europe or Asia or Africa. To this comprehensive view, Kazantzakis gave the name the Cretan glance. As seen by this glance, everything is a fruit-bearing womb of creativity. Yet the Cretan glance is not simply a mountaintop view, it is a vision, a comprehension of the interrelatedness, the interconnectedness of all things, the creative juxtaposition of all separate elements so that they constitute a meaningful whole. In Book 10 of the poem, Kazantzakis has Odysseus wish, "If only I could fight with friends as well as enemies, bring together in myself God and anti-God, yes and no, like that globular peach 4 lips make when they kiss. This is precisely what is achieved in the Cretan glance, a blissful kiss, an exquisite and creative dance of the opposites. But then too, of course, the mountaintop is itself an important symbol for Kazantzakis. It may be taken to represent the essential ascent that we have already noted in the Saviours of God as being the objective of life itself. In Book 7 of the poem, Odysseus finds himself in the city of Knossos, filled with concern about what he perceives to be the forthcoming destruction of the city, consequent upon the corruption with which the royal court is rife. Odysseus pleads with God to come down and assist him retrieve the situation. "I cry out, 'Can't you hear me, God? I'm lost. Come down and help me.'" However, when God does emerge from the shadows, he has a form which is distinctly like, indeed identical with, Odysseus himself. Furthermore, this God exudes timidity and incompetence in the face of the task required of him. Between the columns stood his God. His jaw hung loose and chattered with numb fear, and his eyes glazed with tears. He wore a sea blue pointed cap, and in the dark Odysseus thought he saw his own eyes, chest and limbs gleam, as though his own soul loomed and cried in night. Odysseus is forced to change his understanding of God, coming to the realization that God is in greater need of assistance from him than he himself is dependent upon the mercy of God. The concept of God in the work of Kazantzakis has been the subject of an ongoing disputation that has divided scholars into at least three radically different groups. In the first group, there are those who contend that Kazantzakis grossly offends the Christian interpretation and abuses the gospel tradition. Such a reading has resulted in his work being included on the Roman Catholic Index of Prohibited Books and to rejection by many senior clerics within the Greek Orthodox Church. In the second group are to be found those who contend that Kazantzakis offers new insight into established theological formulations and opens the way to the idea of a processional God, that is, a God who is engaged in an unfolding development of his essence. A third group argues that in the word God, Kazantzakis intends not any Christian or other religious notion of a Godhead, but, following the philosophy of Bergson, is substituting the word for an élan vital, or life force. His reason for doing this is that he notes the widespread use of the word God to indicate the highest value of which man is capable of conceiving, and feels that he must use it to maximize communication. In support of this third group, we may note Freyr's insistence that God, for Kazantzakis, is identical with the élan vital, the onrushing force throughout all of creation, which strives for purer and more rarefied freedom. For Kazantzakis, God is the absolute manifestation of the tireless and fully engaged man. Man is the saviour of God in the sense that through our struggles we maintain and enhance the spiritual quality of life itself. Kazantzakis addresses the question of Christianity quite specifically in Book 21 of his poem. Odysseus one day comes across a Negro lad who is occupied as a fisherman. He is clearly intended as a representative figure for Jesus. The lad is a strong advocate of an eternal Father who reigns in a state into which a man might enter only by the Father's grace and only after a lifetime dedicated to good deeds. Odysseus has serious misgivings about such a pronouncement, although he is nonetheless impressed when the lad indicates that if he was struck on his cheek, he would not retaliate with a raised fist, but would simply turn the other cheek in contrast to the Roman law of lex talionis, an eye for an eye. For Odysseus, however, the final stumbling block is the lad's strong emphasis on and concern with the soul to the exclusion of the body. Odysseus senses a false antithesis, believing that the soul can only be purified and expanded through the appropriate activity of the body. For Kazantzakis, the soul alone suggests a spurious religious emphasis, while the soul and body in unison represent spiritual integrity. In the account of Odysseus' temporary residence in Egypt, as set out in Book 12 of the poem, our intrepid traveller manages to offend the reigning pharaoh by challenging him to confront the terror that presents itself to him in his dreams. Enraged, the pharaoh banishes Odysseus and his companions, but rather than being discouraged by these events, Odysseus interprets them as an opportunity to press further into the fullness of life. As he leads his small band of followers through a landscape filled with difficulties and terrors, Odysseus meets some resistance from some of his men who want to return to Egypt even though that means an acceptance of slavery. Odysseus tries to persuade them to continue on by presenting them with a vision he claims has been given to him by the gods, of a city that must be built and in which they will find security. There is a biblical parallel to Kazantzakis' account, of course, in the Old Testament story of Moses leading the children of Israel out of Egypt. However, in the Kazantzakis version of the Exodus, the significance lies in the fact that there is no promised land, no land flowing with milk and honey to be possessed. Odysseus knows that there can be no such city as that which he projects to his friends. He understands that it is an aspiration, a lure, by which he seeks to encourage them to press onward and upward. This horizontal journey out of the wilderness is represented by the vertical ascent that Kazantzakis posits as the most urgent responsibility of the human race. Kazantzakis makes this point explicitly when he has Odysseus explain to his people that if the vision of the more and the new that lie ahead is aspirational, then it is the human struggle that keeps it alive. At dawn, it seemed as though the sun had cracked their heads, for all broke into tears, leapt to their feet and cried to the great archer now to give them pause. When seven-souled Odysseus heard them, his heart flared. The cap on his grey head stood up from his great rage. By God, then leave your bodies here for wolves to eat. No one has ever passed these sands who had no spirit. If you had spirit, even your hunger would change its course and turn to a proud rage and to unyielding spite. This quotation nicely illustrates the contention of Peter Bion that one of the basic themes of the Odyssey, a modern sequel, is the conflict between participation and withdrawal. While it might appear that the majority of people choose to pretend that the abyss does not exist and that the key to life is a hedonistic self-satisfaction, genuine life lies in the engagement of the mind in an attempt to penetrate the mysterious and in an extension of the spirit in the direction of an ever-expanding wholeness. In pursuing these objectives, a man achieves a fundamental freedom for which he has an innate longing. Odysseus is the engaged man par excellence. In a letter to a friend written in 1943, Kazantzakis comments that every soul is sometimes ready to burst because it senses that the highest labour and the highest joy and sorrow and the most daring ideal are too large for it. Nothing will fit into it except nothing. It utters a cry. Then it regains its strength and courage, silences the evil spirit inside itself, and resumes the ascent. Odysseus does the same. He listens intently, gains courage from the horror, and resumes his chosen path, the ascent. The ascent, in the spirituality of Kazantzakis, is no mere advancement of the individual, although it certainly does engage him in his own development through the unfolding of his own potential. It is rather the upward spiral of life itself, as it seeks to win more and yet more territory from the abyss, more and more clarity out of the mysterious. The ascent is an acceptance of the perpetual newness that lies within the void, awaiting discovery. Kimon Fryer reminds us that for Kazantzakis, the purpose of a man's life is to be understood as a going beyond the mind, the heart, and hope, beyond his ego, his race, and mankind even, beyond all phenomena, and plunging further into a vision of the invisible, permeating all things and forever ascending. Our final example of Kazantzakis' use of his poem to exemplify his broader philosophy is provided in the penultimate book, 22. Odysseus sails towards the South Pole, which represents the extremity of the globe and of life. Odysseus is approaching his own death. At first, there is a deep sense of nostalgia as he reflects upon the exhausted years. He gathered all his memories, held time in his hands like a thick ball of musk, and smelled in the wastes with flaring nostrils till his mind was drenched with scent. Time melted in the lone man's fingers till his nails dripped with aromas like the birds of inner Asia flown from rich woods of nutmeg blooms and pepper root. He was drained pure till life turned to immaculate myth. Next comes an overwhelming appreciation of all that life has held for him. The 5 tumultuous elements that strove for years to forge the famous form of the world-wandering man shifted and parted now and slowly said farewell. Earth, water, fire, air, and the mind, keeper of keys. Like 5 old friends who have caroused the whole night through, then stand at dawn by crossroads, for the talk is good, and make half-hearted stray attempts to part at dawn, but find still more to say, and stand with door ajar, and still hold hands and switch their fingers, lingering still. Thus, like these 5 old friends who had caroused all night, the archer's 5 strong elements, his 5 proud friends, stand at the crossroads of his brain and could not part. More specifically, he recalls 3 memorable incidents. First, he remembers his first woman, the poignant, delicate encounter with which life commences. She is succeeded by the moment when he first held his firstborn son in his arms, life's continuance. Finally, there arises in his vision the first man he slew in battle, and he is reminded of the cycle of life and death, and of the cosmic battle in which all men are engaged from their first breath to their last. For Kazantzakis, death was as much a beginning as an end. Indeed, at a profound level, it was neither end nor beginning, but simply an event in the ever-revolving cycle of life. With Dylan Thomas, he saw the endless beginning of prodigies suffer open, and that to return to the abyss out of which we come is simply to be open to the suffering through which destruction becomes creation. Through the living of our days, we issue a resounding cry into the vast abyss, and there it lingers in an everlasting echo that acts as weather bell for those who come after us. Here, we tell them, here is safe. Or, no, not there, you will sink. But the echo also challenges them. Do not linger here. Press on. Reach what you cannot. And they hear us, in the deepest, most silent chamber of their being. Kazantzakis himself has written, Odysseus is the man who has freed himself from everything, religions, philosophies, political systems, one who has cut away all things. He wants to try all the forms of life, freely, beyond pains and systems, keeping the thought of death before him as a stimulant, not to make every pleasure more acrid or every ephemeral moment more sharply enjoyable in its brevity, but to whet his appetites in life, to make them more capable of embracing and of exhausting all things, so that when death finally comes, it would find nothing to take from him, for it would find an entirely squandered Odysseus. But perhaps he better expresses this view when he puts it into the words of Odysseus. Let death come down to slavish souls and craven heads with his sharp scythe and barren bones, but let him come to this lone man like a great lord, to knock with shame at his 5 famous castle doors, and with great awe plunder whatever dregs that to his sturdy body still have not found time in his great fight to turn from flesh and bone into pure spirit, lightning, joy, and deeds. The archer has fooled you, death. He squandered all your goods, melted down all the rusts and rots of his foul flesh, till they escaped you in pure spirit. And when you come, you'll find but trampled fires, embers, ash, and fleshly dross. Death may be an unwelcome inevitability, but its meaning can be grasped through the acquisition of a broader view of the meaning of life. Dance, a key symbol in all of Kazantzakis' writings, means entering into the harmony of the universe and life itself, and experiencing the resounding rhythm that expresses itself in the human heartbeat. Dance is, as Odysseus showed on the morning after he slew the suitors, the most appropriate of graveyard behaviours. In seeking to make some evaluative statement about the place of this monumental work within the canon of world literature, we find ourselves challenged by its sheer size and its intense depth. Perhaps we can do no better than to settle for Peter Byrne's summation of the work when he writes, "The epic attempts to portray the entire cosmic situation as the life force's evolutionary journey through matter in a creative process that unmakes itself, transubstantiating matter into spirit." In this sense, the poem is concerned not merely with one man's odyssey, but with mankind's existential journey. We might, however, reflect just a little more on the writer's purpose, his poetic prowess, and his philosophical position. In a long letter, written primarily to set out his position with respect to communism, Kazantzakis provides us with a note about his future plans. He writes, "For the next 2 or 3 years, I am assigning my life a single goal, to conceive in the womb of the Odyssey the cry of future humanity. In presenting us with this work, he is maintaining the very foundation of human spirituality, giving expression to the cry with which mankind protests against any notion of its insignificance and asserts its crucial role in the upward thrust of life. Nothing, in truth, is more superficial or more barren, writes Kazantzakis, than the discussion as to whether or not the Odyssey is an epic poem or whether the epic is a contemporary art form. Historians of literature come only after the artist has passed. They hold measuring rods, they take measurements and construct useful laws for their science, but they are useless for the creator because he has the right and the strength, this is what creation involves, to break them by creating new ones. Unquestionably, Kazantzakis has written new laws in setting down his poem. In 1918, the English soldier poet Wilfred Owen wrote, "My subject is war and the pity of war. The poetry is in the pity." The foundation of Kazantzakis' poetry is twofold. It lies in the language and in the philosophy. In terms of the language, it would be difficult to find a poet who has matched the exquisite expression Kazantzakis has forged in all of his writings, but most especially in this major work. Kazantzakis wed poetry to philosophy and philosophy to poetry. Poetry is the natural language of philosophy, for it takes the idea deeply not merely into the mind, but into the soul, where it can blossom and thrive. And philosophy gives poetry its deepest content, separating it from the prosaic and the superficial. In the highest form, there is the highest content, just as in the highest content there is the highest form. In poetry, form does not simply follow function, it is function. This is perhaps why the most important word in all of Kazantzakis' work, the word Ascent, is both a poem in itself and a philosophical statement. It can be argued that Kazantzakis was primarily a poet, but the fact is that his poetry is a philosophy, and it is a philosophy of profound significance to the modern world. Read in conjunction with its companion volume, The Saviours of God, this magisterial volume offers a worldview that attracts with its simple beauty, astonishes with its richness, and has the power to transform common experience into a vibrancy that shimmers with life's essence. The least that can be said of it is that it is a priceless diamond nestled neatly within the jewel case that is the mind of man.